The stakes for the November elections in Minnesota are high, with an open seat for governor on the ballot and control of the state house and Senate up for grabs. At the federal level, Minnesota is ground zero for control of Congress, with 2 U.S. Senate races on the ballot, and where 4 of the 8 congressional races are too close to call. Tom Hanson and John Reich of Winthrop and Weinstine are here to give us a peek into their crystal ball. Tom is a shareholder in the regulatory and government affairs practice at Winthrop and Weinstine in Minneapolis. Winthrop and Weinstine has represented the Lignite Energy Council since 1995. Tom has over 30 years of experience working in government and politics in both Washington, D.C. and in St. Paul. He began his career with Congressman Arlen Stangeland, earning his law degree at George Mason University while working on Capitol Hill. After law school, Tom returned home to Minnesota to work for the Republican caucus at the Minnesota House of Representatives. After helping the House of Republicans win the majority in the 1998 elections, Tom worked in the Speaker's office before joining the administration of Governor Tom Pawlenty as Deputy Chief of Staff and then as Minnesota's Commissioner of Management and Budget from 2006 to 2010. Tom joined Winthrop and Weinstein in 2010. John is Director of Government Relations at Winthrop and Weinstein. Prior to joining the firm, he served as staff in both the Minnesota Legislature and Governor Mark Dayton's administration, most recently as the Public Relations Officer and the Director of Government Relations for MNsure. John has led the Government Affairs Department at the Minnesota Department of Commerce. Prior to joining the Dayton administration, John spent 5 years on staff at the Minnesota House of Representatives, including 3 years as the committee administrator for the House and Labor Committee. Please help me in welcoming Tom and John.
Good morning. And yeah, I did wake up to the thunder and the lightning and wondered where the heck I was. Thank you for having us here today. On behalf of my colleague John and myself, I'm Tom Hanson. We are delighted to be here to talk about what we talk about every day, which is politics. The only thing better for us is to wake up and talk about the Vikings, the Twins, or the Wild. So we're thrilled to be here and talk with you. Our goal today is to talk about, give you a framework of the Minnesota's political environment, and then we're just going to walk through each of the elections. We're going to start with the state, and we're going to transition to the federal elections, and then give you, to the best of our ability, our hot takes or bold predictions. It has been a weird year in Minnesota politics. And it started about a year ago when our U.S. Senator Al Franken resigned from office shortly before the midterms in 2017. And that started a chain reaction of dominoes that are still falling today. Senator Franken leaves office. Our Lieutenant Governor, Tina Smith, gets appointed to his position, which then creates an opening in Lieutenant Governor, and by our Constitution, our President of the Senate goes and gets appointed or becomes Lieutenant Governor, which then opens up a state Senate seat where our Senate, we're going to talk about in a minute, is tied 33-33. So that seat will determine who's in control of our state Senate. And then we have 4 U.S. House races that are up for grabs. So it is a really turbulent year in our politics.
And then on the state side, what happened, we talked about the U.S. Senate races. We had the Democratic Convention, and by the way, we're going to say DFL a lot, which is Democratic Farmer Labor Party in Minnesota, and it's the only state that calls the Democratic Party that. But so Tom and I will say DFL from time to time, just means the Democrats. But the DFL state convention this year was really interesting insofar as the Attorney General Lori Swanson, who had said that she was going to run for re-election as Attorney General. There was some speculation she was going to run for governor. She, at the last minute, didn't get endorsed at the DFL convention, which meant then that a gentleman by the name of Matt Pelican, who heretofore hadn't had any political career, got endorsed, sort of a no-name candidate. Well, that meant then that our Congressman Keith Ellison in the 5th District, represents Minneapolis. He then filed, after that took place, to run for Attorney General along with about 4 other candidates from the State House and Senate and others. That opened up his congressional seat. That meant that a whole bunch of folks started running for that seat for the DFL endorsement. It's a solidly Democratic district. That opened up a bunch of State House seats because a lot of folks in the State House were going to run for that election. So as we walk through these different races, I think it's worth noting that, as Tom mentioned, both at the federal and the state level, there's been a lot of shifting and dominoes falling, which has led to a lot of candidates on the ballot this fall that probably 6 months ago you never would have thought have been on the ballot.
So Minnesota's political climate is, if you look in rural Minnesota, Donald Trump is popular in rural Minnesota. Minnesota has 87 counties. So in 82 counties, he's relatively popular, and in the metro area, he's not. The 7 counties around the metro area. A recent poll found that 56% of Minnesotans disapprove of Trump, while 39% approve. But you look at rural Minnesota in particular, the Iron Range, northeastern Minnesota, which has traditionally been Democrat for years, Trump is fairly popular because of the tariffs on steel. His numbers and the Republican candidate there seem to be doing well. By the same token, his numbers, while very positive in the southern part of the state, in the 1st Congressional District, where soybeans are predominantly grown, the tariffs are playing a little more of a heavy toll on Republicans, although they're still positive in the 1st District. And then you get to the metro area, and generally in the 7-county metro area, he is not very popular. It's worse in Minneapolis and St. Paul. It's a little better in the suburbs, but not as good. So what does that mean? Our governor's race, we have an open governor's seat, and Governor Dayton, our 8-year governor, is retiring, and our DFL candidate is Tim Walz, who's leaving the 1st Congressional District. And as we go forward in the conversation, you kind of picked up from our intros, John is the Democrat of the 2 of us, and I'm the Republican, so we'll be filtering our comments based on our perspectives. So why don't you talk about Walz?
So Congressman Walz has represented the 1st District since the mid-2000s. He unseated a 12-year incumbent, Gil Gutnicht, in the 2006 elections, and has survived both the Tea Party wave and the Trump elections in a rural district as a Democrat. So he has been a rising star on the DFL side in Minnesota for his ability to represent a rural district as a Democrat and take a more moderate stance on a number of issues. He threw his hat in the ring for governor earlier this year. He had a contentious primary. There were 2 other candidates, one from St. Paul who was sort of carrying the Bernie Sanders mantra, very liberal, very progressive candidate. And then as I mentioned earlier, Lori Swanson, our Attorney General, didn't get endorsed at the DFL convention. She threw her name in for the governor then, and so then she was also running in the primary. Traditionally, her support had been up in the Iron Range area and with women. And it was a 3-way primary, and Congressman Walz won it with 41% of the vote, and Aaron Murphy, who was the Bernie Sanders candidate, came in second. But he won it handily. He's one of the things that folks like about Tim Walz on the DFL side is that he is, a rural Minnesota guy. There's this metro-rural divide in Minnesota that I think a lot of folks across the country are experiencing. He's seen as a way to bridge that divide. The one thing that haunts him to some degree on the DFL side is that as a congressperson in a rural district, he voted pretty conservatively on a number of issues. And so for some Democrats, they see that as a liability, or they don't like that. That said, he's got broad appeal and is likely is the front runner at this point, and we think likely to win.
The Republican candidate is Jeff Johnson. He is originally from Detroit Lakes, just across the Minnesota-North Dakota border. He went to college in the Fargo-Moorhead area at Concordia, and he's served as a Hennepin County commissioner for 2 terms. He defeated former Governor Tim Pawlenty in the primary in somewhat of an upset. Jeff won quite handily, and in part because more Republicans showed up for the primary than had in the past in these elections. He, if you look at Jeff is a attorney, went to Georgetown, has a employment law background. He ran for Attorney General in 2006, and he lost to Lori Swanson. He ran for governor in 2014 and lost to Mark Dayton. And if you, we've had 2 recent polls. The first one, the Star Tribune Mason-Dixon poll, early, right after Labor Day, showed that Walz was winning 45-36. The KSTP, which is a TV station out of the cities, USA Today, about the same time period, had Walz 47-40. So there haven't been any polls since then. Polls are hard to figure out because you have to determine if everybody, I mean, who's actually voting? I mean, are they actually getting the voting base? Republicans will argue at this time of the year, and they are in this race, that Jeff is doing a lot better than meets the eye, and that it is really a toss-up. And I am starting to feel more optimistic, in part because they reported, their campaign finance reports last week each have over $1 million. At this point, 4 years ago, Governor Dayton had a lot more money on hand than Jeff did. So, and then the Republicans through the business PACs are going to be supporting Jeff quite a bit. So I am much more, he's smiling because I've been thinking Walz is going to win, but I'm much more optimistic on Jeff just in the last week.
One last thing I'd say on the governor's race, Tom can be as optimistic as he wants. There's been 4 polls performed, and on average, Walz is a +7 lead. And if you look at 2014, Governor Dayton went into the election having 3 polls done with a +7 lead on average and won by 5.5 points. So, you know.
And one final thing to keep in mind, Walz barely won his congressional seat the last time, and he was the heavy favorite to get endorsed at the DFL convention, and has seemed in this cycle to underperform every level of his expectations, even barely winning the primary. So at least that's my hope. Attorney General. The last time a Republican was Minnesota's Attorney General, Nixon was president. I think the Vikings had only been to 1 Super Bowl, and Watergate hadn't even happened yet. It was 1971. Minnesota traditionally and typically elects Democrats to this office. As John said earlier, the Attorney General office became open when Lori Swanson decided to file on the second to the last day of filing. So it caused a chain reaction, and Keith Ellison left his 5th congressional district race to jump into the Attorney General race. The Republican candidate is from the southeastern suburbs of Minneapolis. Doug Wardlow is a Georgetown graduate, served 1 term in the legislature, and has represented various conservative legal causes at a national level. Ellison?
Keith Ellison is a longtime legislator. He served several terms in the Minnesota House before running and being elected to the 5th Congressional District as their congressperson. The 5th Congressional District is made up of the city of Minneapolis, the 1st and 2nd ring suburbs for the most part. It is a solidly Democratic district, and so really the election is the primary in the endorsement process. He beat out, I think, 12 candidates about 10 years ago when in the endorsement process in the primary to win that seat. He had previously served in the state legislature and represented North Minneapolis. He has been a high-profile congressperson in the last several years. He ran for chair of the Democratic National Committee, didn't win, but is vice chair of the DNC, and has been an outspoken critic of the Trump administration and has aligned himself with Bernie Sanders and that progressive wing of the party. The race, as you can see on the polls, is probably a lot tighter than it should be. As Tom mentioned, the Democrats typically walk away with this election. Congressman Ellison has been plagued recently by some allegations that he verbally and emotionally, and I think even physically, abused his former girlfriend. She came out with those allegations right before the primary, the DFL primary. She said that there was a video, but wasn't willing to show it because it was too traumatic. In the absence of that video, I think that there was still a question in some people's minds, so he still won the DFL primary for the Attorney General's race. And as a result, I think you see that the Star Tribune and Mason-Dixon poll have him up by 5, and the KSTP and Survey USA have the race virtually tied. I would say the race is virtually tied due to the margin of error. And it'll be interesting to see how these allegations are sorted out as we move closer to the election, whether or not that has an impact insofar as a Republican winning the office. Congressman Ellison has called for a congressional ethics investigation into the allegations that were made against him. Additionally, the state DFL party hired an outside attorney to investigate the allegations, and they just submitted their report last week and said that the allegations are unsubstantiated in the absence of any real evidence. In other words, the accuser didn't show the attorney the video either, and without that evidence, they concluded it's unsubstantiated. This has been political hay for the Republicans in a big way in the context of the Me Too movement. That Senator Franken, as Tom mentioned earlier, was forced out of office due to sexual harassment allegations, as were a number of state legislators in Minnesota earlier this year, and due to allegations similar to the ones that were alleged against Congressman Ellison. So now the GOP is saying, well, if what's good for the goose is good for the gander. I mean, if we had to force Al Franken out and some state senators, shouldn't we force Keith Ellison out? So I think that is going to be the defining issue of this race, less so on the merits maybe of what each would do in the office. So that is a dead heat, and I think it's going to be an interesting one to watch.
One final comment on that race, and it's just the polling. As JR said, the Star Tribune poll has Ellison up by 41-36. If you're a Republican in Minnesota, you generally look at the Star Tribune and figure they overestimate the Democrats' turnout, and that you figure they add 3 or 4 points onto their total. And I look at the KSTP Survey USA as 41-41, and that tells me that it's probably more even. The Minnesota House, they're up every 2 years, 134 members, one of the largest in the United States. It's currently, it was 77, 57. There's some vacancies now because people left office. It is 2 Democrats, 1 Republican have resigned since session ended. To talk about the House Democrats.
The control of the Minnesota House is up for grabs. The Democrats have not controlled the Minnesota House since 2013-2014 session, and previous to that, it was the Tea Party wave had the Republican control. So it's been in a bit of the wilderness here for the better part of the decade. And really, as we discussed earlier, the midterm elections for the president's party that's in power typically don't go well, and I think the House Democrats are banking on that. We saw it in '94 Clinton midterms, saw it in Obama in the 2012 midterms. I don't know why it wouldn't be true during this this current environment, although I'm almost worried to predict anything. I don't know what world we're living in anymore when it comes to predictions. But that said, the battle is going to be in the suburbs. As we mentioned earlier, if it really is a referendum on the president, then the suburbs are the place where the president's numbers are down, the favorability is down, and there's a lot of talk about these two sets of seats. The first is the Hillary 12. In the last election, there are 12 seats in the Minnesota that were occupied by Republican state legislators, House members, that Hillary won in those districts. And they're all made up of the western and southeastern suburbs of Minneapolis and St. Paul. Conversely, the Republicans are going on offense in those seats that are held by a Democrat, but Donald Trump won in 2016. So you've got the dichotomy set up here where you've got the Hillary 12 in the suburbs and the Donald 7 in greater Minnesota. Additionally, and the Democrats, by the way, need 11 seats to win the majority. The Democrats, however, have also had 5 retirements in seats that they need to hold. 2 of them in greater Minnesota, 3 of them in the suburbs. And so really, the Democrats have to win 16 seats in order to take the majority. What they would say is that if you look back through history, at the midterm elections for the president's party in power, the Minnesota House has typically swung, on average, 17 seats for whatever party that is opposite the president in a midterm. So they're saying if history is any guide, we should pick up on average of 17 seats, which will put them over the top to take the majority. Either way, it's going to be a slim majority, I think, because even if the Democrats do make gains or the Republicans make gains, it's generally believed that some Republicans will lose in the suburbs, they may gain a couple in the metro, but it will narrow the margin of control regardless of party.
The Republicans believe that there's 11 seats in the metro area, and there's 2 of their seats in the outstate area, one around St. Cloud and one up on the Iron Range around International Falls. Those 2 seats, the St. Paul seat, the Ways and Means chair has suspended his campaign, so the Democrat is likely to win that. So the Dems will pick one up there. And then the Iron Range seat is up for grabs. So that leaves the suburban seats, and the Democrats have to run the table, for the most part, on a number of Republican women incumbents who have survived for multiple terms in tough situations, from the eastern side of the metro all the way around. So they have to knock off longtime incumbents who are good at raising money and raising funds. I think that the Dems pick up a number of the metro seats and the 2 outstate seats, and I'm gonna throw a number out. It's gonna be either 68-66 for the Republicans or 70-64. I think the Republicans won this majority 2 years ago when, in a presidential year, they went from 75 to 77, which is unprecedented. They haven't gone up in a presidential year in forever. I don't think it's ever happened in modern times. So they were able to pick those seats up. Our Senate is tied 33-33. They were, after the last election, 34-33. The Republicans, on the strength of Donald Trump's showing in Minnesota. And by the way, he won my home county, which is in northwestern Minnesota. It's Mahnomen, and it is Mahnomen County. And I don't think Republicans won there since the 1930s and even come close. So that is, on the strength of his popularity in rural Minnesota, the Republicans swept in to the state Senate. We now have the open seat, which is west of St. Cloud. It is probably the most reliably Republican seat in the entire state.
So as we mentioned earlier, Senator Fischbach resigned her seat because the Constitution said she had to become lieutenant governor after the governor appointed his lieutenant governor to the Senate. Stay with me here. And so therefore it opened up a open seat, as Tom mentioned, in Stearns County, and it is reliably Republican. That said, the Democrats went out and found a candidate by the name of Joe Persky. He is a pro-life, pro-gun Democrat who's won elections in that district. He was mayor of a city called Sartell, and then he was just recently, 2 years ago, elected county commissioner. And so they like his chances because his views fit the district and he's won elections in that district. And apparently he's also a marathon runner and is door knocking the rural parts of the district, and he literally runs between the farms to train for the next marathon while he's door knocking. So he's run like 80 marathons or something. So they like the fact that he moves quickly between the farms. So I think that Joe Persky gives the Senate Democrats the best chance of winning. That said, it's an uphill climb in that district.
The Republican Jeff Howe is a longtime House member, represents half the district. He is a decorated member of the Minnesota National Guard, and I would expect he wins that district handily, and the Republicans retain control, 34-33. The next race, our senior senator, Amy Klobuchar, is running for re-election. She is not only Minnesota's most popular politician, but one of the most popular politicians in the country. She typically has over 60% approval ratings. I can't even get that in my own family, so that's pretty impressive. We won't spend a lot of time on this race. She's running against Jim Newberger, who's a state legislator, paramedic, represents the area around the Monticello nuclear plant, and Senator Klobuchar probably will win with 65 or 70% of the vote.
And as I mentioned earlier, because of the Al Franken resignation, we have 2 U.S. Senate seats on the ballot this fall. The Constitution essentially says the governor can appoint somebody to the vacant U.S. Senate seat, but that person then has to run in the first general election that is up. So Tina Smith was our state's lieutenant governor. She ran for the first time for elected office with Governor Dayton in 2014, and otherwise had never been elected to office before. This will be her first election running as the candidate. And so she has been working. It's been an interesting transition. She was appointed in January and immediately started campaigning. So she has deep ties to the business community. Their family had worked in the Twin Cities business community for a long time. She worked in Minneapolis Mayor R.T. Ryback's office for a spell before coming to the state, and also served as Governor Dayton's chief of staff. Many think that in this environment, having a female candidate is important, and that Tina Smith works hard, she's likable, and that she can do a good job on the issues and on TV and raising money.
The Republican candidate is Karen Housley. She's a sitting state senator representing a swing district in the Northeast Metro. Her husband is Minnesota hockey legend Phil Housley, and if you're a hockey fan, you'll know that he's the Buffalo Sabres coach. Karen is a successful realtor and has been a successful high-profile state senator. She has an excellent chance of defeating Tina Smith, in part because Tina hasn't led the ballot before. The other thing to keep in mind with this seat that scares Republicans is that if Karen wins, opens up her Senate seat. It goes to the Senate, drops back to 33-33, and we're sitting in a special election in December, January for control of the Minnesota State House. And that frightens many Republicans.
My prediction on this one is that Tina Smith will win, but not by much.
And I don't know. I don't know what to think. I think Karen probably pulls it out, and we're going to be working in the snow for a Senate seat.
It's going to be a squeaker.
U.S. House.
The U.S. House, typically in Minnesota, we've had a lot of stability except for 1 or 2 districts recently on our congressional side of things, although this year is much different. As you all may or may not know, the Republicans control the Minnesota House and the U.S. Congress by 23 seats. The Dems, of course, need to win 23 to win back the majority. There are 4 of the 8 seats in Minnesota are in play. The ones that are not are 4th District, St. Paul and suburbs, Betty McCollum should win. Tom Emmer in the 6th District, Republican, he should win handily. Colin Peterson, who represents the 7th District, which is the entire western part of the state, he should win handily. And then in the 5th District, as I mentioned, Keith Ellison is leaving to run for AG, and Ilhan Omar is the DFL endorsed candidate in that race and should win that seat, no problem. Now on to the races that are contested. As we mentioned, Congressman Walz, who had previously represented the 1st District in the southern part of the state, is now running for governor, so that is an open seat for the first time in 12 years. There are 2 candidates running. Dan Feehan is the DFL endorsed candidate. Dan is a, gosh, if you had to sort of make a cutout of kind of the perfect candidate for Democrats, he'd be one of the guys that you would cut out or put together. He served in the Army, 2 tours in Iraq, where he received a number of commendations for his service. He taught school then on the south side of Chicago and Gary, Indiana for 3 years, and then he was the Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Obama administration following grad school. So if you are a Democrat running in a rural district in southern Minnesota, you want a veteran. Tim Walz was a veteran. You want a teacher. Tim Walz was a teacher. And you want somebody with defense credentials. And Tim Walz was a defense credentials guy. So in a lot of ways, they're trying to carbon copy Tim Walz, who had been so successful down there. And that's the play on the DFL side.
The Republican candidate is Jim Hagedorn. Jim ran in 2014 and 2016, was defeated by Walz both times. He came within 1 percentage point of Walz in 2016, and had the Republicans found it and pulled it and put some money into it, they might have knocked Walz off last time. Jim has an excellent chance. I think he's going to win this seat. The big issue in this district will be the tariffs and what happens if there's some October surprise regarding the tariffs. If the president announced a trade deal with China or something like that, that would help Jim. I don't know if Feehan is, he may be have the perfect credentials, but I don't think he's well known enough throughout the district.
In the 2nd District, this is the district that represents the southeastern suburbs of St. Paul down into the rural parts of Dakota County. So it's essentially half suburbs, half farms. Angie Craig and Jason Lewis are running. This is a rematch from 2 years ago. Jason Lewis squeaked it out 2 years ago, in large part, I think, due to the fact that Donald Trump had done so well in the rural parts of the state, and of course half this district is a rural part of the district. This year, of course, people view this as a likely flip to Democrat only because there is a large suburban component to the district. And as we mentioned earlier, the suburbs are going to be important places for Democrats, assuming that goes well. Trump won the district, but only by 1 point. And I think that was pretty much the margin between Angie Craig and Jason Lewis. All the major Cook Political Report, all the 538, these blogs and these predictors all have it leaning Democrat. And I just read last night that there's a poll out that shows Angie Craig with a 14-point lead over Jason Lewis, but the poll was ongoing. So the final results, I think, will be available today. But the Democrats are feeling awfully good about this one.
Jason Lewis is a former conservative talk show host along the lines of Rush Limbaugh, only on a Minnesota level. He did win last time, barely. He did during the last cycle. He was behind Angie Craig through most of the fall of 2016, even as much as 5 points about this time 2 years ago, and somehow managed to pull it out. The poll that John is referring to has a 10% margin of error, which would, I think Lewis is going to pull this one out, but just barely, and he's going to be lucky if he does.
The 3rd Congressional District is the Minneapolis suburbs beyond sort of the first and second ring suburbs, and this has been represented by Eric Paulson, is the incumbent for over a decade now, I believe. he has had, the Democrats have seen this seat as a winnable one in the past, only because it's a suburban seat, and they very much like moderate congressional people. I mean, whether you're Republican or Democrat, you have to be right of center or left of center and have to be moderate. So they've recruited candidates over the years and have always felt good about it. It's never gone well. This is the first year where the Democrats and a lot of the political folks on the national level think that it really could flip. Dean Phillips is part of the Phillips family that from the Phillips vodka era, and so he is self-financing the campaign in large part, and has a lot of resources. He's also running sort of a really dynamic campaign. He has a little truck he drives around in. He's using social media in a really a new way. He has a Bigfoot commercial out that even people who aren't Democrats laugh at. So Google Dean Phillips Bigfoot commercial, and it's getting a lot of play. So he's really running, I think, a really good campaign and gives the Democrats a best shot. I think he's going to pull this one out. And this one is going to flip and be part of that group of Democrats that take over the House of Representatives.
Paulson has represented the district since 2008. Before that, he was the House Majority Leader. He fits the district. He's a moderate Republican, has worked with Senator Klobuchar over the years. He's got a tall order in the next month, if you believe the polls. In the 8th Congressional District, the Republican is Pete Stauber. He is a St. Louis County Commissioner. St. Louis County is the county kind of in the whole upper corner of Minnesota. He is also a former police officer. Republicans are doing much better on the Iron Range because they like President Trump's steel tariffs. Trump did very well there in 2016, and I think Stauber is going to pull this one out.
The Democrat is Joe Radinovich. He's a one-term state House member from Crosby, Minnesota. He is, I think he's in his early 30s, and is a young, dynamic, engaging individual, and has managed, I think, to brand himself and cast himself as the sort of traditional Iron Range Democrat, mostly because he's a fourth-generation Iron Ranger. His whole family had worked as members of the trades and in the mining industry. So the creds are there. He's running a really good campaign. That said, it's become a swing district in every sense of the word. It was previously occupied by Rick Nolan, who was a Democrat who represented the district for 3 terms, and in the last election only won by about 1.5 points. So a district that had been reliably Democratic for decades is now one that is really up for grabs. And as a result, it's going to be a really tight race. This is one of those races that's decided by 0.5 point or a point.
One final thing on that race, if you pick up any of Minnesota's TV or TV commercials, you'll see the commercial with Radinovich being chased by police. He's had 18 moving violations, so he's committed 18 crimes. So they show him being chased down by police. It's a funny commercial. I think with that, we'll take some questions.
Tom and John, thank you very much. Real quick, before we proceed, John, you said something kind of interesting, I thought. I made a note of it. You said you don't know what kind of a world we live in regarding predictions. That's my world right there. I can relate.
Yeah, but if I'm wrong, then nobody has to drive through it.
All right. Questions for Tom and John. If you do, please find a microphone. Sherry and Dave are going to be working the crowd here. Go to a microphone if you can, if you have any questions for these gentlemen. Any questions? There has to be at least one for you, gentlemen. It was such a thorough presentation, maybe there are no questions. Okay, I guess
There's one right way back there.
I can't see it. Okay. We got a microphone there, right? There we go.
Hi, back in the 60s during the Humphrey era, Minnesota was just absolutely Democrat to the bone. Do you guys see going forward, now that the legislature is split and you're talking about races, do you see the GOP in Minnesota gaining strength, or are we headed back the other direction in the future?
I don't think we are going back to an era where the DFL controls Minnesota. The 80 counties in rural Minnesota are reliably Republican. The suburbs are reliable for Republicans. A large part of Minnesota politics depends on who the president is. If it's a Republican president and he's been in office 2 years, we have a tougher time in the elections. You go back to 2010, and if you look, that Obama, and while he's very popular now, then he was not. And in Minnesota, Republicans swept just about everything because his numbers, his poll numbers, were about the same as Donald Trump's are now. So no, I don't see that. I see Minnesota as more of a purple state, and I think this election will bear that out.
I would agree, and I think that one of the interesting things about it is that a couple things. First of all, it matters who the candidate is. I mean, people say, well, there's this seismic shift. The Iron Range is going to be Republican now. All the suburbs are going to be Democrat now, and that's the way it is. I still think it matters who the candidate is, and it'll be interesting to watch which way the parties go with regard to which candidates they endorse. The most interesting to watch for me has been to see the president co-opt a lot of the traditional democratic values, these populist values, the tariffs to help steel workers, the starting a little trade war with China to help the farmers, things like that traditionally had been, pretty solid DFL issues. And so as long as that continues and you have a candidate that can have a winning message that people care about, I think, Republicans have a good shot of continuing to make inroads in traditionally Democratic areas. That said, I also think that currently in Minnesota, there is a geographical gap as it relates to politics that pretty much track with the national map. You've seen, the urban cores and maybe the surrounding suburbs lean more Democratic, while the rural areas of the state are starting to air more Republican. And that'll continue as well. It'll be interesting as the years go on. The metro is predicted to continue to grow, and if that's where the population is going to be, and if that continues to vote Democratic, you may have a situation where you have Metro Democrats, running the show in the House or the Senate, and the rural districts might get bigger because population isn't growing there. So the demographics have a lot to say about the next 10 years, in my opinion, as well.
Any more questions? Here we go.
Thank you. Jason Elliott with the Building Trades. What is the role of environmentalism playing in all of this in the state of Minnesota in terms of energy production, the Line 3 replacement, any of that stuff? Is that coming into play?
Go ahead. I think in certain parts of the state, it certainly is. In those areas that are affected by these energy issues, it certainly is an issue. I would say that if you are in the metro area and you're thinking about energy issues or sort of heavy industry like mining, folks in the metro think about the boundary waters and whether or not we should have copper nickel mining up at the boundary waters and whether or not they can do it in such a way so as to not pollute the boundary waters. I think the same thing's true with Line 3. Is there an ability to strike a balance between protecting the environmental concerns while also having this infrastructure we need in order to conduct our daily lives, have our iPhones and drive our cars so we didn't have to ride horses here this morning, things like that. So I think that's one thing that in the governor's race is a big issue for Tim Walz on the DFL side. He is is making an attempt, and I think successfully so, to say, let's strike this balance. We've done it for centuries in this country between the environmental concerns with also the job creation and the industry we need in order to have a robust economy in Minnesota. So I think it's more of an issue for the Democrats to strike that balance than it is for the Republicans, but it certainly is an issue.
Okay, we will need to stay on time, so Tom and John, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
We will now take a break. We'll take a break. Please join me back here at 9:20 for our mine and plant updates. Enjoy your break.